The universal unity into which the living immediate unity of individuality and substance withdraws is the soulless community which has ceased to be the substance, itself unconscious, of individuals, and in which they now have the value of selves and substances possessing a separate being for self. The universal being thus split up into a mere multiplicity of individuals, this lifeless spirit is in equality, in which all count the same, that is, as persons. What in the world of the ethical order was called the hidden divine law has in fact emerged from its inward state into actuality. In the former state, the individual was actual and counted as such, merely as a blood relation of the family. As this particular individual, he was the departed spirit devoid of a self. Now, however, he has emerged from his unreal existence. Because the ethical substance is only the true spirit, the individual therefore withdraws into the certainty of his own self. He is that substance as the positive universal, but his actuality consists in his being a negative universal self. We saw the powers and shapes of the ethical world swallowed up in the simple necessity of a blank destiny. This power of the ethical world is the substance reflected into its simple unitary nature, but that being which is reflected back into itself, that very necessity of blank destiny, is nothing else but the I of self-consciousness. In paragraph 477, we now enter a new subsection of the first portion of the spirit part of the Phenomenology. And Hegel titles this in German Rechtszustand. Miller's translating it as legal status, which makes perfect sense. Zustand can be, condition. Status works just as well, I think. The person is being understood in terms of a kind of legality or a kind of justice. Hegel is here going to talk about it in terms of equality or Gleichheit, right? Things being equal. And what's really key here is that, as he's pointed out, and as he's talking about in this paragraph, the human law and the divine law that occupied so much of the space and the development in the previous two subsections have now been submerged in, as he says, a sort of blind destiny. And the question is, well, what does that look like, and what does that leave us with? So he tells us, he talks here about a universal unity into which the living immediate unity of individuality and substance withdraws, right? So what is that? That is the ethical substance that we've been looking for this entire time, and thinking that we had our finally had grasped it entirely. We'd wrapped our heads and hearts and minds around it, and it always turned out to be not complete. So what shape of ethical substance do we have here? He says it's the soulless community, and it's ceased to be the substance. So something else is going to become the substance in this dialectic that is unfolding for us. Well, what is it going to be? Well, a community is composed of members. And in this case, what Hegel is going to focus on is not the family, but rather the individuals. Individual persons, as he's going to tell us. So he says, individuals now have the value of selves and substances, possessing a separate being for self. What is he talking about here? A kind of individualism. Not necessarily exactly what we picture in our late modern age when we hear that term individualism, but something that is related to it, something that is on the way to it. This is what communities, when they no longer have sort of a dynamic ideal motivating them, when people are no longer engaging with each other, and they're willing to sort of put it in the hands of the law, the government, in terms of just rights and legally defined obligations, limits, equalities, inequalities, procedures. all those sorts of things. When they abstract away from what makes a community distinct, what gives it, as he says, a soul. When that is missing, then the best thing that we do have is what Hegel is calling legal status, right? Because that's better than sheer anarchy or just, one person dominating everything, although we're going to see that's going to come about a little bit later in this section. This is actually an advance of sorts, but it feels like a loss at this stage. So he tells us the universal being is split up into a mere multiplicity of individuals. And he talks about here a lifeless spirit, which is really a contradiction in terms within the Hegelian system. There is no lifeless spirit. A lifeless mind, a lifeless mentality, we might say, is an equality in which all count the same. And he says that is as persons. And you understand in this section, as you read a little bit later on, that persons is kind of a dirty word for Hegel. When we have merely legal persons, this is a low-grade form of spirit. And we might say, oh, this is great because other people can't mess with me and prevent me from living my life goals or charting out my own plan or the pursuit of happiness, if we want to use Jefferson's and also, to a certain extent, Locke's phrase as well, right? But for Hegel, the loss of the meaning found within the community and the necessary inequalities that would come about with that is a problem. So this is going to be a starting point for us. So he goes on and he says, let's make a contrast here. What in the world of the ethical order was called the hidden divine law has emerged from its inward state into actuality. Well, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So the divine law has emerged into actuality, but as we see so often in the dialectic, when something emerges into actuality, it often transforms and turns out not to be what we had originally thought it was or what it presented itself as being, if we want to talk phenomenologically. He says, in the former state, the individual was actual and counted as such, merely as a blood relation of the family. As a particular individual, Hegel tells us, it was in terms of his death and the rights that were given. Or we might extend this a little bit further. It was in terms of the recognition within the family that the individual had the fullness of his, let alone her, because we saw that, women's place was largely confined to the family and the divine law in the dialectic as Hegel has given it to us so far. That's where the locus of meaning and recognition lay. So here he says he's emerged from his unreal existence. So that sounds like a progress, doesn't it? Because the ethical substance is only the true spirit, he is that substance as the positive universal, but his actuality. Here I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Because the ethical substance is only the true spirit, the individual therefore withdraws into the certainty of his own self. We see Hegel once again playing with these two terms, truth and certainty. They've become split from each other. The universal has become, true, but in the process has lost its certainty. Where is certainty to be found? In the self-consciousness, the consciousness for self of each individual. They can be certain of their own status. They can be certain of their own desires. But now it's unclear how that fits into the universal community. So he says, he is that substance as a positive universal, but his actuality consists in being a negative universal self. Why is Hegel talking about positive and negative here? Well, the positive part is that the individual actually does exist and make demands. It's negative insofar as each individual is, in a certain sense, a restriction or a negation in a particularly Hegelian way of the other individuals and of the community by saying, I have rights, I am placing limits on what you can do or what the community can do. Not just in terms of my body, but in terms of my property as well, something that Hegel's going to talk about a little bit later. So he says, we saw the powers and shapes of the ethical world swallowed up in the simple necessity of a blank destiny. This power of the ethical world is the substance reflected into its simple unitary nature, right? This destiny. But now where is the substance gone? He says, that being which is reflected into itself, the very necessity of blank destiny, is nothing else but the I of self-consciousness. What an interesting way to end this first paragraph, isn't it? The very necessity of blank destiny, what it was that the laws of the city and the laws of the family or the divine laws ultimately succumb to, this whole dynamic of individuals representing them, this destiny that swallowed them up, turns out to be not just some historical contingency or to be nature inflicting something, but to be the pure I of self-consciousness. The pure I that we've seen coming up over and over and over again. How is this going to develop? Well, let's look at the next 6 paragraphs and we'll find out. This therefore counts henceforth as a being that is in and for itself. To be so acknowledged is its substantiality. But it is an abstract universality because its content is this rigid, unyielding self, not the self that is dissolved in the substance. This very short paragraph, number 478, is in a certain way just an addendum to the paragraph that came before, but it's also setting the tone for what is to come. And notice that Hegel is going to employ this language that he's been using consistently throughout the phenomenology as something like an endpoint or a telos that we're aiming at, being in itself, being for itself, having these two together. And he says that the I of self-consciousness, that this destiny turned out to be, the I of self-consciousness in each of the individuals that we're talking about, is being in itself and for itself. And so you'd think, well, okay, we must be done here, but we're not. We're just getting started. And he says, to be so acknowledged is its substantiality. So that's sounding good, right? We want acknowledgement. And we're seeking ethical substance. Now notice what Hegel says next. It is an abstract universality. So abstract is okay, but not good. In the Hegelian dialectic, we're always trying to aim for something that's not a mere abstraction, but something concrete, something real, something that we can relate to. So an abstraction is just going to be a beginning point. Why is it an abstract universality at this point? He says because its content is in this rigid, unyielding self, not in the self that is dissolved in the substance. So let's think about this for a moment. What is he saying there? Because is the substance supposed to be the community and the individual would dissolve itself within that? That's been attempted so far, and that never really turned out to work. Or is the substance, in this case, the individual person? Well, if it is, then it doesn't make that much sense for the universal that is this to be dissolving itself in each person. So we must be looking for something else. And what I'm going to suggest here, which is going a little bit beyond the text, is that this is a drive for something that won't be realized in this section, but will be realized later on, much later on in this whole discussion. And it's something that motivated the previous seekings, both in the reason section, particularly the last third of the reason section, and this very beginning part of spirit, which is to have what was being sketched out already in the self-consciousness section, that is a field in which human beings recognize and are recognized within an organic matrix, which could be a community or it could be something else. That is what we're aiming at. That's what's not anywhere close to being attained at this point. Personality, then, has stepped out of the life of the ethical substance. It is the independence of consciousness, and independence which has actual validity. The non-actual thought of it, which came from renouncing the actual world, appeared earlier as the stoical self-consciousness. Just as this proceeded from lordship and bondage as the immediate existence of self-consciousness, so personality has proceeded from the immediate life of spirit, which is the universal dominating will of all, and equally their service of obedience. What was for Stoicism only the abstraction of an intrinsic reality is now an actual world. Stoicism is nothing else but the consciousness which reduces to its abstract form the principle of legal status, an independence that lacks the life of spirit. By its flight from the actual world, it attained only to the thought of independence. It is absolutely for itself, in that it does not attach its being to anything that exists, but claims to give up everything that exists and places its existence solely in the unity of pure thought. In the same way, the right of a person is not tied to a richer or more powerful existence of the individual as such, nor again to a universal living spirit, but rather to the pure one of its abstract actuality, or to that one qua self-consciousness in general. Here in paragraph 479, we're going to see Hegel now discussing something that he hasn't talked about for quite some time, and that is Stoicism. Now, I want to preface this by saying that we don't want to get too bogged down in worrying about whether Hegel adequately captured Stoicism and its potentialities, whether his take on it is totally fair or not. I mean, quite frankly, it's not. It's a bit reductive. He does focus in on certain aspects of it to the exclusion of others in a way that shows really that I don't think he fully understood what the Stoics were up to. But that was very typical of his time, particularly for German scholarship, of the 19th century. What's really important here is the connection that he's drawing between what he's calling the Stoical self-consciousness. Remember that Stoicism was part of the self-consciousness section. It wasn't being treated as something just on its own, for its own sake. And what is developing now in this legal status section in terms of spirit. So Hegel tells us personality has stepped out of the life of the ethical substance. It is left the ethical substance behind, and it has attained a kind of substantiality itself. He says it is the independence of consciousness. And here I actually put the German on the board because I wanted to talk a little bit about what the implications of this are. Miller has an independence which has actual validity, which is not a bad translation. It's a little bit, I would say, it's diverging from Hegel a little bit. Hegel has wirkliche geltende Selbstständigkeit, right? So independence is Selbstständigkeit, right? Being able to stand on one's own, right? Being able to assert oneself in the realm of being. And wirkliche geltende. This is an interesting thing. We might say actually valid, actually backing itself up, right? There's a dynamicity here that I think is a little bit lost in the English translation. An independence which has actual validity. An independence which asserts its own validity, which makes that validity actual. So this is quite important here. Now, notice where he's going after this. He says, the non-actual thought of it, which came from renouncing the actual world, appeared earlier as a different shape of consciousness, stoical self-consciousness. And he says, look, this proceeded from lordship and bondage, or as we now more typically call it, master and slave. as the immediate existence of self-consciousness. And he says, so personality is doing something similar. Personality proceeded from the immediate life of spirit, which is the universal dominating will of all and equally their service of obedience. So what are the connections between the master-slave dialectic and what was occurring in the progressive uncovering of ethical substance in the human and divine law? There was a complete devotion. There was a complete commitment. On the part of the slave, it took place through the fear of the master, the being set to work. Something similar occurred in the interworking of human and divine law and its representatives, eventually realizing that they could not bring that all the way to term, moving to a new shape of consciousness. You know, the master-slave dialectic is not the end of the beginning of culture, right? Stoicism is something that emerges from it. Remember, Stoicism was an advance beyond the master-slave dialectic. Similarly, Hegel is casting legal personality as an advance beyond the life of spirit hitherto. So he goes on and he says... here we go. What was for Stoicism only an abstraction of an intrinsic reality is now an actual world. An actual world for consciousness. That's why I've got this question mark over here. We can say, like Hegel does, look, what was happening with Stoicism? Stoicism, in his view, renounced the actual world. It abstracts from the actual world. It retreats into something that is very powerful, the capacity for human thought. I would say that he is right in some respect to say that Stoicism does focus on the interiority of the human person, on thinking about thinking and thinking about our feelings, thinking about our thought processes, not allowing those things in the rest of the world to dominate what's happening with us and to say, look, you are only an appearance, to use Epictetus's term, right? Or his famous phrase early on in the Enchiridion. I think Hegel is pretty much right about that. Where he's wrong is in saying this is all Stoicism is doing. But for him, this is a sort of reaction against reality. So he says, Stoicism is nothing else but the consciousness which reduces to its abstract form the principle of legal status, an independence that lacks the life of spirit. So the Stoic attains something, but he also loses something in the process. And we saw that there was, for Hegel, earlier on in the self-consciousness section, sort of a contradiction at the heart of Stoicism. It was not able to adequately account for the development of its own principles, for how it is related to the good, the true, the rational, and why it rejects the real. Is that going to be happening here with personality? He says, Stoicism, by its flight from the actual world, attained only to the thought of independence. Is personality going to provide a kind of independence? He says, Stoicism is absolutely for itself in that it does not attach its being to anything that exists, but claims to give up everything that exists and places its essence solely in the unity of pure thought. Hegel says then something really interesting. In the same way, so there is a parallelism to Stoicism. The right of a person is not tied to a richer or more powerful existence of the individual as such, nor again to a universal living spirit, but to what? To the pure one of its abstract actuality, or to that one qua self-consciousness in general. There is not a withdrawal from reality, but you might say an evacuation of the full meaning of reality. There's something missing here in what Hegel is calling personality. Missing because it has been destroyed. The meaning in the dynamic community that was there earlier, that's no longer something available. But notice this other thing that he said here. The right of a person is not tied to a richer or more powerful existence of the individual as such. A richer or more powerful existence of the individual as such. What would be supplying that? That's what you want to consider. Perhaps notions of something like human perfection or virtue or the development of human potentiality is something that he's talking about there. And here's the thing, with legal personality, you don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. You're great. You're golden just by yourself, just by being a person. How sustainable is this going to be? I mean, we know that it is sustainable in a certain respect. It does satisfy certain needs. Is this going to satisfy the human need for something else, to be connected with ethical substance, to be determinately connected with other human beings through recognition? That's what we have to ask and then answer through the rest of this section.